Most gardeners are stuck chasing the same list of so-called miracle plants and fertilizers, while, honestly, ignoring the plants that actually build healthy soil consistently. They plant cover crops in the fall, forget about them in the winter, and then, well, complain about weak beds and poor nutrient cycling come spring. The consequence is a patchy, inconsistent growing environment, slower root growth, and, reduced harvests. I've seen this repeatedly in backyard gardens, raised beds, and even hydroponic setups. That's why I started experimenting with a forgotten marsh plant, one that thrives in wet conditions and feeds the soil all year long. It's simple, underutilized, and incredibly effective, and it really changes how you approach soil management. This plant thrives where most so-called soil builders, just can't make it. Conventional advice tells gardeners to stick with annual cover crops like clover, vetch, or ryegrass. They're fine, really, but they die off in harsh winters or dry spells, leaving the soil exposed. The marsh plant I've been using, which I'll refer to as perennial swamp sedge for this discussion, survives in wet marginal soils and grows through most of the year. It's low maintenance, spreads quickly without becoming invasive, and, most importantly, deposits biomass both above and below ground that enriches the soil. In practice, I've planted it along waterlogged borders in raised beds and, even in small hydroponic side reservoirs. In both cases, it continues cycling nutrients long after other cover crops have gone dormant. It's not just about biomass, it's about root activity. The roots of swamp sedge create channels that aerate heavy clay and sandy soils alike. In one raised bed, I layered a half-inch of compost over the soil and planted swamp sedge between rows of tomatoes. Within weeks, I could see the difference. Roots penetrated deeper, water retention improved, and nutrient uptake was faster. In hydroponic setups, I grow the sedge in adjacent water trays or shallow side containers. The plants release exudates that feed beneficial microbes, which in turn improve nutrient availability in the main system. This is why it's effective year-round. The plant never really shuts off nutrient contribution. You don't need precise formulas, but, ratios still matter. For backyard gardens and raised beds, I usually aim for about one mature sedge plant per square foot of bed. That density provides consistent soil coverage without overwhelming other crops. So, if you're working in a small 4x4 bed, just 4 to 5 plants spaced evenly along the perimeter and between the rows is enough. For larger plots, you'll want to scale proportionally. Now, hydroponic setups require a slightly different approach. One plant per gallon of side reservoir or per linear foot of gutter system usually works well. So, the key here is making sure roots have enough space to grow without crowding out your main crops, but at the same time you're still keeping up that constant microbial feeding. If things get too crowded, airflow drops, and, well, you can get these little anaerobic pockets, which end up slowing down nutrient cycling. This particular plant, it actually improves soil fertility in real time. Unlike most cover crops, which only release their nutrients after they've decomposed, swamp sedge keeps feeding the soil all the time through its root exudates and the leaves it drops. So, in practice, I mow or trim the tops just once a month during the growing season, and, I always leave the clippings right there on the bed. These clippings actually work as a slow-release mulch, feeding the microbes and, well, protecting the soil surface at the same time. In raised beds, this approach has, honestly, reduce the need for supplemental fertilizer by about 1/3. I've tracked nitrogen and potassium levels in beds with sedge, and even during off-seasons levels remain higher than in beds without it. In hydroponic side containers, weekly trimming and adding clippings to the main medium boosts microbial activity and nutrient availability without altering pH significantly. You can combine it with other soil building strategies for even better results. In one raised bed, I laid down a 1/2-inch compost layer before planting sedge along tomato rows. The result was, well, more robust microbial populations and faster root growth compared to beds with compost alone. In hydroponics, I combine sedge roots with biochar or a light compost slurry in adjacent reservoirs, creating a sort of mini ecosystem that feeds the main crop continuously. The advantage is that nutrient cycling is nearly constant, not just seasonal, and plants can access what they need without waiting for traditional decomposition. This plant solves problems that most gardeners don't even realize they have. So, the biggest misconception is that cover crops only need to grow during the main season. In reality, soil continues to lose nutrients, especially in wet or compacted areas, if it isn't actively fed. Beds left bare over winter or in marginal wet zones develop compaction, slow microbial activity, and poor root structure. Swamp sedge keeps the soil aerated and active, even in wet conditions where other cover crops would just rot or, die. I've seen beds with sedge maintain steady organic matter levels through winter and early spring, while neighbouring beds without it required significant amendments to catch up. You can propagate this plant cheaply and effectively. In backyard beds, I take clumps of mature plants and divide them, transplanting into new areas at the recommended density. They establish quickly, usually within 2 weeks. In hydroponics, small shoots can root directly in shallow water trays and then be moved to side reservoirs. It's low cost, low maintenance, and unlike most annual cover crops, it doesn't need replanting each year. I've been using the same stock for 3 seasons with minimal intervention, and the soil continues improving year after year. Moisture management is important but not tricky. While swamp sedge thrives in wet conditions, I've found it tolerates moderate dryness as long as soil isn't fully desiccated. In raised beds, I water lightly when the top 2 inches dry, which keeps the plant active without promoting shallow root systems. Hydroponically, it grows well in shallow nutrient trays with constant water contact, and trimming ensures it doesn't shade the main crops excessively. The plant's resilience makes it far more reliable than most other cover crops, which honestly tend to struggle under irregular moisture regimes. You need to, keep an eye on interactions with other crops. In raised beds, I usually plant sedge along borders or between crop rows, trimming the tops regularly to avoid shading vegetables. In hydroponics, placing it in side containers or gutters ensures root exudates feed the main system without crowding crop roots. The trade-off is minimal compared to the benefits: constant soil feeding, better microbial activity, and healthier root growth. Ignoring this could result in minor competition, but it's easily managed with regular pruning and careful placement. The biggest misconception is that, soil feeding only happens with compost. Traditional advice suggests that compost or chemical fertilizers are the main way to feed soil. But actually, swamp sedge proves that living plants can maintain microbial activity and nutrient cycling all year round. It reduces fertilizer needs, improves structure, and keeps roots actively exploring and feeding, even when other cover crops are dormant. I've documented higher nutrient retention and more consistent yields in beds and hydroponic setups where I use this plant compared to those relying solely on compost or seasonal cover crops. If you're serious about growing food and want soil that improves continuously, the forgotten marsh plant is one of the most effective tools you can adopt. It thrives in wet or marginal conditions, feeds soil year-round, and integrates seamlessly with raised beds, backyard gardens, and hydroponic systems. The principles are simple: maintain proper spacing, trim regularly, and combine with compost or other soil inputs as needed. Over time, soil structure, nutrient availability, and microbial activity all improve significantly. For gardeners who care about results over gimmicks, this is the kind of practical, proven method that changes the baseline of your growing system. So, subscribe to the channel and share this video with other serious gardeners. Every tip here is about creating living, productive soil and stronger, healthier plants, because that's the difference between a garden that struggles and one that consistently produces abundant food.